A number of new features for filters have just been added in the first update to GameMaker this year, making my very recently released video on filters already slightly out of date. So here's the update. First, they've added 4 new functions that you can use to control filters in code. These 4 functions come in pairs of 2. The first pair is layer enable FX and layer FX is enabled. Layer enable FX allows you to turn a filter on or off, and layer FX is enabled tells you whether or not it is on or off. This is a nice quality of life improvement over deleting, hiding, or changing a filter's variables, which is what you had to do before. Now you can accomplish the same results with a single function. So if we look at the code from the last video where we were toggling the blur filter on and off by setting a value, now we can comment out all of this code and replace it with layer enable FX blur effect blur active. And if we want to get really fancy, we can even replace blur active with not layer FX is enabled blur effect. The next pair of functions is even better. They are FX set single layer and FX get single layer. FX set single layer allows us to apply a filter to only a single layer. And FX get single layer tells us whether or not a given filter is currently applied to just a single layer. One very important note here is that for this to work, you have to apply the function to a filter that is not an effect layer. Because if you tell an effect layer to apply only to itself, well, there's nothing on that layer besides the effect, so that would be like turning the effect off. But this also means that now you can create and apply filters directly to any layer. So here I'm creating a layer and applying it to an instance layer, the player's instance layer, and then in the step event I'm getting the FX struct with layer get FX, and then toggling single layer mode on and off. You can also apply a filter to a single layer in the room editor, but probably not in the way that you think. GameMaker has something called an inspector, which basically no one uses because it is very much a work in progress. Yo-Yo Games has been slowly adding to it over time, but since it currently duplicates existing features and I'm used to the old way, I don't use it very much, and you might not either. However, it's the only way to apply a filter to a single layer in the room editor. You can find the inspector by going to Windows, then Inspector, position it how you like, then click on any layer in a room that isn't an effect layer, and now you have the option to add a filter or effect directly to that layer in the inspector. The next and final change is another quality of life improvement. You can now use FX Create without having to include the filter somewhere in the game, as GameMaker will detect the filter you want to use automatically. So in the last video, I included an empty room with the desaturate filter so I could create this filter in code. If I hadn't, the game would have crashed. But that's no longer necessary, so I've deleted that room from the project. So those are all of the improvements added to filters in this update, and if you somehow made it all the way through this video without having watched the first video on how to use filters, there's a link to that video in the top right.